All right. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Enrique. Thanks again to National Geographic. As the voice of God said, I am Nick Giuliano. I'm the Deputy Energy Editor at Politico. I'm excited to be here this morning. We're going to talk about biodiversity and what we might be able to do to address some of these concerns. Joining us this morning, we have Congressman Raul Grijalva. He's the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. Next to him, we have Leah Gerber. She's a sustainability scientist and the founding director of Arizona State University's Center for Biological Diversity Outcomes. And then at the end, we have Linda Krueger, a senior policy advisor for the Nature Conservancy. Again, thanks everybody for being here. We'll have some time for questions at the end. Also, for those of you watching online, we'll be taking questions on Twitter. Please use the hashtag Politico Climate. So let's kick it off. Dr. Gerber, you were a contributor to the report that Enrique mentioned and that I'm sure most of the people here are familiar with. 1 million species are at risk. Biodiversity in crisis. Easy, simple first question. How worried should we be about this?
Well, we should be very worried. As you probably have seen, the headline estimates that emerged from our analysis indicate that up to 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Now, this is based on a lot of analysis of available data. Our best estimates of the number of species on the planet, as Enrique indicated, we have not yet estimated the total number of species on Earth, but we do know for the described species what the percent of threatened status is. So using those numbers, we were able to come up with the estimate of 1 million species. Now, the reason these species are imperiled has to do with the direct drivers, the direct threats, which include habitat loss, overexploitation, pollution, introduced species, and of course the exacerbating impact of climate change. The indirect drivers are economic growth, unsustainable consumption, poor governance, and other issues that impact those threats. So I think it's important to really think about these drivers of threats to biodiversity. And what we did with the global assessment is review our progress towards global targets. For example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Convention on Biodiversity, Aichi targets. And we have established these targets for the year 2020, and we found across the board that we're making poor progress towards meeting these goals. So the recommendation that came out of the global assessment is that we really need transformative change in our financial and governance systems to address these indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And this will be brought to the upcoming China conference in China next year.
Now, how do you, Linda, I want to ask you about this. You know, we're talking about biodiversity, but that's kind of an intangible concept, right? So, I mean, how do you define what biodiversity is and what the value of this is to someone who, you know, may not be well versed in the sustainability goals?
Well, it's all life on Earth, and it's both at the species level, and it's about genetic resources, and it's about habitat, and so it's really all life on Earth is biodiversity, and the Convention on Biodiversity that Leah spoke to is trying to address it at all those different levels, of course. So. But the number one thing that we have to do is stop the conversion of natural habitat, because that covers a lot of the rest. So if there's one take home, I would say that, you know, that is where we have to go. And as Enrique said, you know, the work on protected areas is core to that. But we also need to look beyond protected areas and address the threats of that habitat loss. And to a large degree, those come from the production sectors, agriculture, infrastructure. So we have to be working through those sectors to make sure that they are expanding, they are developing sustainably. And there are tools to do that, but it's a very big challenge. It's not easy by any means.
Chairman Grijalva, can you talk about some of those tools? I mean, what what's your view of how well the U.S. government is doing at addressing, habitat loss and conservation goals?
Well, at this juncture in time and in history, government reaction in terms of policies has been to regress as opposed to go forward, and I think that attitude and that those policy initiatives that we see, whether it's deregulating, rolling back protections, weakening existing laws, when many of those existing laws, whether it be endangered species, whether it be the designations around wilderness and other issues, water consumption and protection of that finite resource, when you see those things being rolled back, then I think that the United States, through its policy and through its administration here, are contributing to the overall crisis with our climate and threatening even more biodiversity. I think what the tools are available to us, and many times are tools that I think here in the United States, domestically and internationally, there are things that we could do from a policy standpoint, both to instruct industry on how to go forward, and also become the guide. And when you look at the United States and its landmass and its responsibilities of the committee that I'm very privileged to chair regarding oceans and coastal areas around this nation and its waterways, and you see its landmass, we potentially, that's a resource through public policy, strengthen and reform legislation that exists already, new legislation can begin to become a contributing part with 23% of that responsibility that falls within that jurisdiction. So yeah, I think it's the to-do list is very, very large. But I don't think we can be satisfied by merely going back to what we had before Trump to what we need to do going forward. And I think, issues of 30-30, I think are applicable to public lands as well. 30 by 30. I think we can be an instrument that stimulates the process as opposed to being an instrument now in terms of public policy and our lands, an instrument that is contributing to the problem.
What are the arguments that you find that work best as you're talking to your colleagues on Capitol Hill to convince them of some of these goals? I mean, how do you make the pitch?
Well, the issue around climate change has gone from the debate has gone from it's not real, prove it to me, to general avoidance. Let's not have this conversation. But I think that the economic, national security, public health, and overall well-being of this nation of ours is at stake. And I think that the urgency is I think the tone that needs to be carried into the debate as much as anything else. There was a time when pragmatism was a discussion. Is it 2050? Is it 2040? Is it 2030? That was the point of contention. Where do we fixate? Well, I think based on not only the two reports, but what was happening across this planet and certainly in this country as well, that pragmatism now is not enough. That those kinds of timetables, that we're in more of a transformative point, and I think we have to bring that transformative urgency to a much higher level. I think the American people are with us. It's just channeling that and in a very blunt way, say that there are consequences politically to elected representatives that continue to ignore the issue. That's got to be part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, and there are physical consequences that we're seeing. I mean, Dr. Gerber, can you talk a little bit about what are the things that an average American might notice in his or her life that is different now than it was 10 or 15 years ago, and is a consequence of biodiversity loss?
Right, that's such an interesting question. I think about my own childhood growing up snorkeling in Hanauma Bay in Hawaii and seeing vibrant coral reefs and marine fish and going back to that same location, and there's still plenty of fish, but the coral are dead. Yet the tourists who go there now think it's spectacular. So we have this shifting baseline of what is pristine. I think biodiversity is a really challenging concept for the average person, in that there's a plurality of ways that we can value it. I think from an economic standpoint, it's unequivocal that biodiversity is the foundation for our economy. Without biodiversity, we won't have the services, the ecosystem services that emerge from that diversity, water purification, for example. But we could also argue that biodiversity is like art, and it's priceless, and in itself, it should be valued. So it's I think the challenge that we've had is very much linking that plurality of values into mainstream economies. And we are starting to chip away at that.
Mm-hmm. And this is one of the problems that climate researchers are having too, in terms of, assessing the social cost of carbon or the potential risks that are in store from climate change, is the difficulty in assigning a dollar value to the fish around the reef or the forest health. Or how do you try and grapple with those sort of technical issues, and are there breakthroughs ahead that you see?
So the two ways that the two challenges in bringing biodiversity into the mainstream of financial markets relate to both measuring it appropriately, and we as scientists have done a pretty good job at developing different metrics that we use to measure biodiversity at different scales, ranging from genes to species to ecosystems, and trying to then link that relevant scale to the decision-making context. But what's challenging is actually assigning a financial value to biodiversity. And there's some, we're starting to move in that direction, looking at, for example, in the corporate sector, what is the range and what is the relevant typology of ways that a company might begin to look at biodiversity? This might be reputational risk, mm-hmm. This might be material value, mm-hmm. The necessary operations, green infrastructure are some of the ways that we do this. I think, again, the challenge is that we have some ways of quantifying the values, but those metrics are not all encompassing of the full potential value that incorporate the priceless nature that many of us view, from which we view nature. Mm-hmm.
And this is obviously an international issue as well, Linda. I wanted to to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on some of the policy measures that are available to implicitly price biodiversity. So if the U.S. or other countries establish clear mitigation policies for infrastructure development, for conversion of natural habitat, it suddenly makes it expensive for developers to go into certain areas. And the U.S. has traditionally been a leader in that with its wetlands mitigation policy and other things to really avoid loss as much as possible and avoid these conversions. And that's sort of a way of establishing that. We've also, in the Nature Conservancy, we've done some very interesting projects trying to value biodiversity, for example, in Caribbean coral reefs, where we've developed with Swiss Re a parametric insurance policy that pays out for reef restoration to protect the hotels and the tourist industry in Mexico. And so there are ways of doing this, and as companies increasingly recognize the risk of ecological collapse and the threat that poses to their bottom lines and their reputational risk, and that as countries recognize that, I think these tools will become a little more mainstreamed. But that's really what the Nature Conservancy has been working on, to get that value of biodiversity embedded in the way we do business.
Do you find that there's hesitancy? You mentioned the tourism value of a lot of these resources. Do you find that there's a hesitancy or a sort of disincentive to grapple with the magnitude of biodiversity loss when doing so would potentially say to tourists, don't come snorkel on our reef anymore?
The insurance policy, though, is to protect the reef, and it's a way of ensuring that that reef persists and that the tourists still have something to see when they come there. So yeah, no, it's tourism is one clear benefit from restoring nature, but it doesn't work everywhere. We have to be clear that not every place is going to be a tourist magnet, and there are probably limits. So there have to be other mechanisms in place too, and it really has to be driven by a planning framework that identifies the most important areas for biodiversity. You know, where are watersheds, where are key intact remaining areas, of which there are a very dwindling amount, and how can we protect those? So I just wanted to throw out one figure. G20 talks about $90 trillion worth of infrastructure that is supposed to be built in the next 30 years. That's twice as much infrastructure, footprint-wise, than what we have on Earth today. Where is that all going to go? When we've done some scenario projections, we've shown that this could double the amount of converted habitat in Latin America. It could triple the amount of converted habitat in Africa. I mean, this could be catastrophic for the Earth as a whole. So we have to really be able to work kind of on a global level, to get back to your international question, to plan for those developments and to drive them in a way to minimize losses and stop conversion of natural habitat.
But can we still see the full 90 trillion, or will that number have to fall in addition to doing what is needed, sort of responsibly?
I mean, a lot of it's needed for climate change, right? This is about transforming the energy sector, so a lot of it's about renewable development, and so it's replacing other things. A lot of it is about roads, which have very severe fragmentation effects if they go through intact areas. So maybe you got to put the road around those intact areas. There are a variety of planning techniques, but yeah, it's going to involve a coordinated effort by both scientists and policymakers, and the financial industry is also key to this because they really are determining where the investment goes.
And, staying on the international front, Congressman Grijalva, you were in Madrid earlier this week with Speaker Pelosi and the delegation. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the overlap that you see between the conversation we're having here about biodiversity and the needs to address climate change, and where those intersections happen?
Maybe in a couple of, in one area in particular, I think the interconnectedness of the visit that Speaker Pelosi put together was very, very good, and at the end of the visit, she asked what was significant for you, and my response to her was the credibility that I felt we had as a delegation representing the United States, absent everybody else that should have been there. Second of all, the urgency that we have to rejoin the discussion, rejoin the Paris Accord, even though now the principal points of it are dated and we need to move to other areas, other benchmarks. And the other thing that I noticed was that the expectation of the delegates that were there from all over the world, except the three primary polluters, which is India, China, and the United States, their expectation for the United States to lead, to set that tone, to be the leader, and the fact that we're not playing that leadership role is to our own detriment here in the United States. And the one area I saw the tremendous overlap is in meeting with representatives of indigenous communities worldwide, and the significant role that they play both here in the United States as indigenous people and around the globe in terms of what that added value they bring and that strength that they bring to the discussion of the conservation of our biodiversity system. I thought that is an area that has been strengthened, I hope, in the last year in terms of the indigenous communities here in the United States, but it is certainly an area in which we need to pay more attention and rely on, I think, some of the values that the indigenous community are bringing to the discussion. I thought that was very, very powerful. The other were vulnerable nations, nations that don't have the economic wherewithal but want to protect themselves and protect their communities. And the need for us to join into that fund to make sure that those vulnerable nations, I mentioned in that panel that there should be no misery index when it comes to the mitigation and adaptation to climate change and the change we need to have. Some should suffer more than others. And again, the United States plays a huge leadership role in terms of the resources it could bring to bear to that question.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the resources available in the United States, I mean, it's been, a difficult process to try and get any sort of climate change legislation considered. I mean, we all remember what happened 10 years ago, and the realities of divided government being what they are, nothing seems to be immediately on the horizon. But are there smaller steps that you can take? I mean, the Land and Water Conservation Fund is an item that's up for discussion right now. How important is that to conserving biodiversity, and how optimistic are you that
I'm really proud of the research committee. I think we've generated some pieces of legislation, Land and Water Conservation Fund being one, the banning of mining around the Grand Canyon to protect that icon, but more importantly, the watershed, and again, in cooperation with the indigenous tribes in the area that were the huge advocates for it, the reform of the mining law, and and more wilderness designations. The question is an appropriate one. Congress, we do that, the House passes it, and then it goes to the Senate, and what happens in that abyss? I don't know what happens in that abyss. And but I think it is very important, and we're going to do the same thing when it comes to the role that public lands can play and oceans can play in addressing the climate change crisis that we're in. We might have a moratorium on extraction until we have a plan on how we're going to meet a goal. And we need to deal with those and pass those pieces of legislation, because I think the American people, and to some extent the world, need to see that there's another template on how to deal with that issue, not the avoidance in the Senate and the hostility that we find in this administration toward dealing with climate change. So I think the role that we have and those pieces of legislation are important, because that's what we're providing people with a choice here. If you want this choice, then things have to fundamentally change as we go forward in order to get some of these things done. I think that's our job, to provide that template, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Dr. Gerber, I want to bring you in here. I mean, to what extent is the biodiversity conversation and climate change conversation ultimately the same discussion? I mean, is it worth differentiating those two discussions, or are the solutions to both problems ultimately the same?
In many cases, well, they're definitely integrated. When we think of the global challenges to sustainability with respect to food, water, energy, health, climate, there are dependencies with respect to biodiversity. With the global assessment, for example, in all scenarios where we explored future projections of what the world would look like, the dire consequences of biodiversity loss are magnified by climate. And I wanted to just jump in and briefly touch on a point that you made regarding the infrastructure. In fact, direct things that we actually can do with respect to biodiversity conservation, both within the US and also internationally, are fund conservation efforts required to recover imperiled species. So to just give you the numbers in reference to the numbers that you referenced earlier, in the US, to implement recovery plans to recover all endangered species in the US, it would cost, at a minimum, approximately $2 billion per year. Now, that is a mere fraction of some of the numbers that we're talking about with respect to infrastructure development. Globally, the estimate is approximately 76 billion per year. So these are small numbers, and I think the key challenge that we have is precisely in integrating these conservation efforts into other sustainable development goals and planning with respect to water, energy, climate, health. so that we can start looking towards a sustainable future.
Can I just pick up on that
Yeah,
point
please.
as well, the nature-based solutions? So our work has shown that nature-based solutions can provide about a third of the climate change mitigation needed by 2030 to stay on track to the 2-degree target. So that's a phenomenal part of the solution. So there's these restoration efforts and other work on protection, avoiding loss, will allow us to help fight the climate change crisis and the biodiversity crisis at the same time. And that's not just forests. We hear a lot about forest restoration and forest sequestering carbon, but also mangroves, other ecosystems, wetlands, prairies, everything. Natural ecosystems sequester carbon. They also provide adaptation to sea level rise, and there's a lot of fantastic opportunities, both for jobs, as Enrique mentioned at the beginning, for a restoration economy that helps solve both the biodiversity and the climate crises together.
One more factoid on that note that I think is a really interesting example is that the Amazon in Latin America is one of the most biodiverse areas on the planet, and it also is important for carbon sequestration. So we've done extensive analyses showing that you can actually meet both goals by protecting Amazon rainforest.
And so how do you do at the Nature Conservancy when you're going to try and develop a new corporate partnership or convince a corporation to clean up their act or act more sustainably? I mean, what does that pitch look like? How do you convince them that it's in their best interest when they know that federal regulation won't be something they have to worry about for?
Well, I think a lot of
who knows how
companies
long.
are kind of coming to that realization themselves and coming to us actually for help. So, the World Economic Forum in the last few years, when they've done their global investment risk assessment, these ecological issues are really coming more and more to the front. And so companies are starting to say, hey, maybe we need to look into this. So we have some, frankly, controversial partnerships with some big ag companies and others, and oil companies we've worked with, chemical companies. But my argument is, if you want to solve the problem, you have to kind of go to the source. So we have to try to work with corporate actors that want to change, that want to figure out better investment models, better business models, and clean up their supply chain, reduce their impacts, support a level playing field globally so that they're not undercut by less responsible actors in other countries. And I think there's a win-win here, right? And we don't always agree. And a lot of our corporate partnerships, we kind of go into them saying, hey, we might argue about some things. We're not going to be issuing all our press releases together. But I think there's growing recognition, and it's coming from a lot of different parts of society.
Chairman Grijalva, do you want to weigh in? Are you optimistic that type of approach can work?
Yeah, and I think, like I said, that right now, in terms of industry and in the broadest sense of the definition of industry, whether it's extraction or development, I think the lines of engagement have to be a little bit clearer in terms of the policy legislative arm and the interest of industry in what happens, because it's not a coincidence that at the Department of Interior is run by a former lobbyist for all the industries that I've just spoken about, including fossil fuel industry, development industry, etc. It's no accident that the second in command of Bureau of Land Management, same, and the list goes on and on and on. And I mention that because that's been that's for the last 3 years plus. It's been where policy is developed and where implementation of regulations are developed. I think you got to make that line clear, and government as an agency, as a facilitator for what the Conservancy is doing, and others need to have this kind of independent oversight going forward, and that hasn't been utilized the way it has been, and as a consequence, we get decisions that then force you legislatively to have to be much more proactive, much more bolder, in order to make that distinction clear. And that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in right now. The limited transition period in terms of working with industry. And I said earlier when I opened that I think the legislative, we can provide a guide, an impetus to how that development goes forward. And I think that's kind of the role that we're kind of left with at this point, because we have to catch up. The new normal is going to have to be much different than the old normal, and that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up?
Sure.
Because absolutely there is a leading role for government in sort of setting the guardrails here. I don't think it happens. And I think it, to some degree, or to a considerable degree, the industry is going to respond to a predictable playing field, and if they know what those guardrails are, they'll respond. And it also provides it provides a level playing field internationally as well, if it's done properly, and if we can incorporate these sort of guidelines into our foreign investment policy and the new global biodiversity framework.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Gerber, I mean, what were your conclusions on this question? You know, can the rates of economic growth that we've seen historically continue while preserving biodiversity? I mean, is there a compatible way to sort of square the circle here?
In short, no. The current rates of economic development are unsustainable. In fact, there was a recent piece that said that how can we even attempt to quantify the value of biodiversity in economic growth when the current system of economic growth is responsible for the biodiversity loss. Mm-hmm. So I do think that we do need transformational change in our consumption patterns, our production patterns, the current incentive structures that are given to food production, water management, that are completely unsustainable. I also think, with respect to the industry engagement, that there is a growing desire within the corporate sector, or at least a sector within the corporate sector, for doing the right thing, mm-hmm. being sustainable, vaguely caring about biodiversity. But what I see as a large divide in being within the academic world and working outside of the academic world with companies in the corporate sector is that we're not doing a great job in bringing the knowledge we have to the on-the-ground decisions that are being made. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the work that's being done in the corporate sector is purely voluntary, mm-hmm. and we haven't even scratched the surface of if a company hypothetically cares about biodiversity, how do they go about measuring it? Mm-hmm. How do they go about reporting it? And that is with the assumption that they care. What we need to be doing is setting up the incentives mm-hmm. and the structures so that there is an incentive to report on biodiversity conservation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, we've only got about 5 minutes left. I want to give the audience an opportunity. If anybody has questions, we've got a couple of microphones going around. Feel free to, yes, back here, please.
Yeah, right now there's millions of hectares of degraded land in this country. I don't know how much of that land is still privately owned, but what do you see as the specific mechanics of obtaining that land for ecological restoration?
You want to start with
yeah,
Linda at the end?
I'd be happy to take that. I think that's one potential bright area is sort of the whole agricultural space, because I think there are great win-wins for improving soil retention, improving nutrient retention, reducing impacts of agriculture broadly. And there's a whole convention, actually another UN convention, that's principally concerned with restoration of degraded lands, and it's not just in the US, but globally. There are a lot of places that could be improved for agricultural production, and that is a way of expanding your agricultural lands without impacting biodiversity quite so much. And different forms of agriculture also can have much lower impacts on biodiversity. I mean, there are things that can survive in an agricultural landscape, and I can't speak specifically to the land acquisition issue in the U.S., although I would say the Nature Conservancy works a lot to conserve wild areas. I don't know that we purchase land for restoration in the U.S. exactly, but I think that's maybe the next stage, but certainly driving a restoration economy in the U.S. and globally through mitigation requirements and basically obligating that restoration process is a huge win-win and can improve food production and make things cheaper for farmers, improve nutrient content in food. Because right now, globally, we've got about $500 billion of agricultural subsidies, most of which are supporting unsustainable food systems. And so if we can change that incentive so that we are incentivizing more sustainable forms of agriculture, that would be a huge win-win for biodiversity, climate, and food.
Chairman Grijalva, do you have thoughts on?
Just on the issue of acquisition of additional land for restoration, utilizing the Land and Water Conservation Fund or other funds available within Interior to acquire land has usually been to complement existing park, monument, wilderness, refuge. I think we need to redefine that part of the effort has to be a significant part is acquiring to restore. And that's not part of the priority list right now, and it should be. And the other issue is the agencies responsible for some of the infrastructure work, Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, reprioritizing restoration as part of their mandate, I think would be a significant step. But we have not had significant acquisitions, even when we have willing sellers. So that whole mentality about the federal government acquiring more land has to fundamentally change, because if we're going to prioritize restoration, if we're going to prioritize buying back grazing rights, then we need to have that approach, that if we have willing sellers, then that they should be the priority right now, and they're not.
Okay. Anybody else in the room? Yeah, there's one more question back here I think we've got time for.
Hi, I'm Joel Dunn from the Chesapeake Conservancy, and just wanted to say I really admire your perspective, admire your leadership, Mr. Chairman. My question has to do with something a little differently than you've discussed today. I really appreciate your sort of high-level perspective on conservation and the future of conservation. But it has to do with how we, as a community, empower local conservationists with the tools and information they need to take charge. Given the power structure, in a sense, has changed a little bit from the top down, we've seen in the Chesapeake a lot of really exciting things from the ground up. And I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit to some of your experience of the tools and policies and skills that will give them the resources and knowledge that they need in order to take charge over their landscape locally, so that can grow into a much larger effect across the country and across the world.
We did a unique and different process in the bill that we're going to be submitting on environmental justice in terms of nationwide for frontline communities and vulnerable communities. And what we did is that we did bottom up. And I would suggest that has been very productive. There's buy-in, there is participation, there is identification of issues, and we have a much better piece of legislation because we did bottom up. And I think that needs to be the approach. As much as I think I have the right idea, I don't. And much of what we got in this EJ bill is very good and comprehensive as a consequence of it coming from practitioners as opposed to from us down.
I think we're going to have to end things there. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I don't want to keep anybody beyond. I know the chairman has a markup to get to this morning. So let me just say thanks again to the panel. I think we had a very interesting discussion here about some of the opportunities available at all levels of government and the work that needs to be done. Chairman Grijalva, Leah, Linda, thank you all for being here. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Thank you.